Welcome to another journey through the quiet corridors of history, where we explore the stories that time has gently tucked away. Tonight, we travel south, along the ancient Nile, beyond the familiar pyramids of Giza, beyond the bustling markets of Memphis and Thebes, to a land where golden sands meet darker stones, where the river flows through granite cataracts, and where a civilization rose that would not only rival ancient Egypt but in many ways surpass it. This is the story of the Kingdom of Kush, the Nubian Empire that for over 1,000 years commanded respect, accumulated wealth, and wielded power that stretched from the heart of Africa to the shores of the Mediterranean. While Egypt often captures our imagination with its pharaohs and pyramids, tonight we'll discover how their southern neighbors quietly built something even more remarkable. Let us begin our journey in the land the Egyptians called Ta Seti, the land of the bow, recognizing the exceptional archery skills of its inhabitants. The Greeks would later call this region Nubia, derived from the word nub, meaning gold, for the precious metal that flowed from this land like water from a spring. But the people themselves called their kingdom Kush, and it was here, in the region we now know as Sudan, that one of Africa's most sophisticated civilizations would flourish. Picture, if you will, the landscape that gave birth to this remarkable kingdom. The Nile River, that great lifeline of northeastern Africa, flows northward through a series of rocky barriers called cataracts. These natural obstacles, formed by granite outcroppings that force the river into narrow, turbulent channels, created both barriers and opportunities for the ancient peoples who lived here. Between the first cataract at Aswan and the sixth cataract near modern-day Khartoum, the river valley alternates between narrow gorges and broader, fertile plains where communities could establish themselves and thrive. The first cataract traditionally marked the southern boundary of Egypt proper, though Egyptian influence and control would ebb and flow beyond this point. Throughout history, south of this barrier lay the realm that would become Kush, a land blessed with natural resources that would make it the envy of the ancient world. Gold deposits sparkled in the eastern deserts, accessible through wadis that led from the Nile Valley to the Red Sea hills. Copper mines dotted the landscape, providing the raw materials for tools and weapons. Precious stones, including amethyst, jasper, and carnelian, could be found in abundance. Ebony and ivory came from the south, along with exotic animals like elephants, leopards, and giraffes that would grace the courts of pharaohs and kings. But perhaps more valuable than any of these material riches was the kingdom's position astride the great trade routes that connected sub-Saharan Africa with the Mediterranean world. Caravans laden with gold, spices, incense, and exotic goods passed through Kushite territory, and the rulers of this land grew wealthy by controlling and taxing this commerce. The earliest inhabitants of this region were Nubian peoples who had developed sophisticated cultures along the Nile Valley for millennia. Archaeological evidence reveals that by 3500 BCE, these communities had established permanent settlements, developed pottery traditions, and begun the process of state formation that would eventually lead to the Great Kingdom of Kush. The relationship between these early Nubian kingdoms and Egypt was complex from the very beginning. During Egypt's Old Kingdom period, roughly 2686 to 2181 BCE, Egyptian pharaohs launched military expeditions south of the First Cataract to secure access to Nubian gold and other resources. Egyptian texts from this period describe campaigns against Nubian chieftains and the establishment of trading posts and fortifications in Nubian territory. Yet this was far from a one-sided relationship of Egyptian domination and Nubian submission. The Nubians were formidable warriors, skilled in archery and renowned for their courage in battle. Egyptian reliefs and texts frequently depict Nubian soldiers serving as mercenaries in Egyptian armies, valued for their military prowess. The pharaohs of Egypt's Middle Kingdom, from roughly 2055 to 1650 BCE, found it necessary to construct a series of massive fortresses along the Nile between the first and second cataracts to maintain control over the trade routes and protect Egyptian interests in the region. These fortresses, with names like Buhan, Semna, and Kama, were marvels of military engineering, featuring thick walls, elaborate gate systems, and sophisticated defensive arrangements. Yet their very existence testifies to the strength and persistence of Nubian resistance to Egyptian domination. The fortresses were not built to defend against a weak enemy, but against a people who posed a genuine threat to Egyptian control of the southern trade routes. During Egypt's Second Intermediate Period, roughly 1650 to 1550 BCE, when central authority in Egypt collapsed and the country was divided among competing dynasties, the Nubians seized their opportunity. They pushed north, reclaiming territory that had been under Egyptian control and establishing their own administrative centers in the region between the First and Second Cataracts. It was during this period that the Kingdom of Kush began to emerge as a unified political entity. By around 1600 BCE, a powerful Kushite kingdom had been established with its capital at Kerma, located between the Third and Fourth Cataracts. The rulers of Kerma controlled a territory that stretched from the First Cataract in the north to beyond the Fifth Cataract in the south, making it one of the largest kingdoms in the ancient world. The city of Kerma itself was a marvel of ancient urban planning. Archaeological excavations have revealed a sprawling metropolis with elaborate palaces, temples, workshops, and residential districts. The famous Kerma Defufa, a massive mud brick structure that still stands today, served as both temple and fortress, its imposing bulk a testament to the power and wealth of the Kushite kings. The rulers of Kerma adopted many aspects of Egyptian culture, including Egyptian religious practices, artistic styles, and even hieroglyphic writing. Yet they maintained their distinctly Nubian identity, creating a unique synthesis of Egyptian and African traditions that would characterize Kushite culture throughout its long history. The burial practices of the Kerma period provide fascinating insights into Kushite society and beliefs. The royal tombs at Kerma were enormous structures, some measuring over 90 meters in diameter, surrounded by the graves of hundreds of sacrificed retainers. These human sacrifices, which included soldiers, servants, and craftsmen, were intended to serve the king in the afterlife, reflecting beliefs that were similar to, yet distinct from, contemporary Egyptian practices. The wealth displayed in these tombs was extraordinary. Gold jewelry, elaborate ceremonial weapons, fine pottery, and imported luxury goods from across the ancient world testified to the far-reaching trade connections and accumulated wealth of the Kushite elite. Perhaps most striking were the Egyptian goods found in these tombs, including royal Egyptian regalia and religious objects, suggesting that the Kushite kings saw themselves as legitimate heirs to pharaonic tradition. The golden age of the Kerma kingdom came to an end around 1500 BCE when Egyptian armies under the pharaoh Thutmose I successfully conquered the region and incorporated it into the Egyptian empire. For the next 500 years, Kush would exist as an Egyptian province, governed by Egyptian administrators and gradually becoming more thoroughly Egyptianized in its culture and practices. Yet even during this period of Egyptian domination, the Kushites maintained their distinct identity and continued to play important roles in the broader Egyptian world. Many Nubians rose to high positions in the Egyptian administration, military, and priesthood. Nubian gold continued to flow north, helping to finance Egypt's imperial ambitions and monumental building projects. The pharaohs of the new kingdom, including such famous rulers as Hatshepsut, Thutmose III, and Ramesses II, relied heavily on Nubian resources and manpower to maintain their empire. During the reign of Akhenaten, the heretic pharaoh who attempted to revolutionize Egyptian religion in the 14th century BCE, Kush remained loyal to the traditional Egyptian gods and played a crucial role in the eventual restoration of orthodox religious practices. This loyalty to traditional Egyptian values would prove to be a defining characteristic of Kushite culture and would later justify their claim to be the true guardians of Egyptian civilization. As the New Kingdom period drew to a close around 1070 BCE, Egyptian control over Kush began to weaken. The pharaohs faced increasing challenges from invasions by the Sea Peoples, internal political strife, and economic difficulties. Egyptian garrisons were withdrawn from Nubian fortresses, and local Kushite leaders began to assert their independence. It was during this period of Egyptian weakness that the Kingdom of Kush experienced its most remarkable renaissance. Around 1000 BCE, a new Kushite kingdom emerged with its capital at Napata, located near the Fourth Cataract at the foot of a distinctive flat-topped mountain called Jebel Barkal. The Kushites regarded this mountain as sacred, believing it to be the dwelling place of the god Ammonius, and it would remain a religious center of paramount importance throughout Kushite history. The early rulers of this renewed Kushite kingdom were deeply influenced by Egyptian culture and religion, yet they developed their own distinctive interpretations of pharaonic traditions. They built temples dedicated to Egyptian gods, used Egyptian hieroglyphic writing, and adopted Egyptian royal regalia and ceremonial practices. Yet they also maintained important aspects of their African heritage, including their own languages, customs, and artistic traditions. The rise of the Napata kingdom coincided with a period of political fragmentation in Egypt itself. After the end of the New Kingdom, Egypt entered what Egyptologists call the Third Intermediate Period, characterized by weak central authority and division among competing dynasties. The country was often split between rival pharaohs ruling in the north and south, and foreign powers began to play increasingly important roles in Egyptian politics. It was into this power vacuum that the Kushite kings would eventually step, claiming to be the legitimate successors to the great pharaohs of Egypt's past. The first Kushite ruler to make serious moves toward conquering Egypt was King Kushite, who ruled around 760 to 747 BCE. Kushite pushed his armies north beyond the traditional boundary at the First Cataract, occupying much of southern Egypt, and even installing his daughter Amenartis as God's wife of Ammonius at Thebes, one of the most important religious positions in Egypt. But it was Kushite's successor, Pi, who would achieve what no African ruler had accomplished before or since: the complete conquest of Egypt and the establishment of African pharaohs ruling from the Nile Delta to the heart of Nubia. Pi's conquest of Egypt, which took place around 747 to 716 BCE, was one of the most remarkable military and political achievements of the ancient world. Unlike many conquerors who relied on superior technology or overwhelming force, Pi succeeded through a combination of military skill, diplomatic cunning, and religious legitimacy. The story of Pi's conquest is preserved in a remarkable document known as the Victory Stela of Pi, a granite monument discovered at Jebel Barkal that provides a detailed, first-person account of the campaign. Reading this ancient text is like listening to Pi himself describing his triumphant march down the Nile, and the picture that emerges is of a deeply religious man who saw himself as chosen by the gods to restore proper order to Egypt. According to his stela, Pi was initially reluctant to launch a full-scale invasion of Egypt. Instead, he sent armies under his generals to deal with what he saw as the growing chaos and impiety in the north. But when reports reached him that his forces were struggling against a coalition of Delta princes led by a ruler named Tefnakti, Pi decided that divine intervention was required. The Kushite king traveled north to Thebes, where he performed elaborate religious ceremonies at the great temple of Karnak, seeking the blessing of Ammonius for his campaign. Only after receiving what he interpreted as divine approval did Pi launch his assault on Lower Egypt. The conquest that followed was swift and decisive. City after city surrendered to Pi's armies, often without a fight. The pharaoh's account emphasizes his clemency toward those who submitted willingly and his harsh treatment of those who resisted. At Memphis, the ancient capital of Egypt, Pi's forces conducted a textbook siege, ultimately breaking through the city's defenses and capturing this crucial stronghold. What makes Pi's conquest remarkable is not just its military success, but the manner in which it was conducted. Throughout the campaign, Pi presented himself as a restorer of traditional Egyptian values rather than a foreign conqueror. He made offerings at Egyptian temples, followed Egyptian religious protocols, and showed deep respect for Egyptian cultural traditions. When he finally reached Memphis and entered the ancient palace of the pharaohs, he performed the traditional ceremonies that confirmed his legitimacy as Egypt's rightful ruler. The Delta princes who had initially resisted Pi's advance eventually submitted to his authority, recognizing him as pharaoh of all Egypt. Tefnakti, the leader of the resistance, made his submission in a letter that has been preserved, acknowledging Pi's divine right to rule and begging for mercy. With Egypt under his control, Pi had achieved something unprecedented. He ruled an empire that stretched from the Mediterranean Sea to the heart of Africa, making him the most powerful monarch of his age. The Kushite pharaohs who followed Pi would rule Egypt for nearly a century, forming what Egyptologists call the 25th dynasty. Yet perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Pi's conquest was what happened next. After receiving the submission of all Egypt's rulers and being acknowledged As pharaoh throughout the land, Pi simply returned to Nubia. He left Egypt under the control of the local princes who had submitted to him, content to rule his vast empire from his palace at Napata. This decision reflects a sophisticated understanding of imperial administration and a confidence in his legitimacy that few conquerors have possessed. Pi's successors, however, would take a more hands-on approach to ruling Egypt. His brother and successor, Shabaka, who ruled from around 716 to 702 BCE, established a permanent Kushite presence in Egypt, ruling from Memphis and implementing policies designed to strengthen central authority and restore Egypt's former glory. Under Shabaka's rule, the Kushite pharaohs began an ambitious program of restoration and construction throughout Egypt. They repaired and enlarged temples that had fallen into disrepair during the political chaos of the Third Intermediate Period, commissioned new statues and monuments, and revived ancient Egyptian artistic and architectural traditions that had been neglected for centuries. The Kushite pharaohs were particularly devoted to the god Ammonius, whom they regarded as their special patron and protector. They lavished attention on Ammonius' great temple at Karnak in Thebes, adding new structures, restoring ancient halls, and enriching the temple's already vast holdings. They also promoted the worship of Ammonius in their Nubian homeland, building magnificent temples at Jebel Barkal and other sacred sites throughout their kingdom. This religious devotion was not merely ceremonial. The Kushite pharaohs saw themselves as the chosen servants of Ammonius, responsible for maintaining cosmic order and ensuring the prosperity of their subjects. This sense of divine mission would drive their policies throughout their reign and would ultimately bring them into conflict with the rising power of Assyria. The reign of Shabaka's successor, Shabitku, who ruled from around 702 to 690 BCE, marked the beginning of a new phase in Kushite history. During this period, the Great Assyrian Empire, based in what is now Iraq, was expanding westward, conquering Syria and Palestine and threatening Egypt itself. The Kushite pharaohs found themselves drawn into a complex web of international politics, forming alliances with smaller kingdoms against Assyrian expansion and ultimately facing the full might of the Assyrian war machine. It was under Shabitku's successor, Taharka, that the Kushite Empire reached both its greatest extent and faced its most serious challenges. Taharka, who ruled from 690 to 664 BCE, was perhaps the most remarkable of all the Kushite pharaohs, a ruler whose reign would be remembered for centuries after his death. Taharka came to the throne as a young man, inheriting an empire that stretched from the Mediterranean to the heart of Africa. He was a vigorous and ambitious ruler, launching military campaigns that extended Kushite influence even further north into the Levant while simultaneously strengthening Kushite control over the Nubian heartland. Under Taharka's rule, the Kushite Empire experienced a remarkable cultural and economic renaissance. The pharaoh commissioned ambitious building projects throughout his realm, constructing new temples, palaces, and monuments that rivaled the greatest achievements of Egypt's classical pharaohs. At Jebel Barkal, Taharka built a magnificent temple complex that served as the religious center of the Kushite world, while in Egypt he added his own structures to ancient sites like Karnak and commissioned entirely new temples in the Delta region. The wealth that supported these building projects came from the empire's vast resources and far-reaching trade connections. Nubian gold continued to flow north in unprecedented quantities, while luxury goods from across the known world passed through Kushite-controlled trade routes. African products like ivory, ebony, exotic animals, and precious stones were exchanged for Mediterranean goods, creating a commercial network that enriched the Kushite treasury and spread Nubian influence throughout the ancient world. Yet it was also under Taharka that the Kushite Empire faced its greatest external threat. The Assyrian king Esarhaddon, having consolidated his control over much of the Middle East, turned his attention to Egypt. In 671 BCE, Assyrian armies invaded Egypt, marking the beginning of a conflict that would ultimately end Kushite rule over the northern kingdom. The Assyrian invasion was a traumatic event for both Egypt and Kush. Unlike previous foreign invasions, which had often been relatively limited affairs involving competing Egyptian dynasties, the Assyrian assault was a full-scale imperial conquest conducted by the most powerful military machine of the ancient world. Assyrian armies were equipped with iron weapons, siege engines, and cavalry. forces that gave them significant advantages over traditional Egyptian and Kushite forces. Despite these disadvantages, Taharqa mounted a vigorous defense of his empire. He reorganized his armies, incorporating new military technologies and tactics, and launched a series of counterattacks that initially drove the Assyrians out of Egypt. For several years, control of Egypt swung back and forth between Kushite and Assyrian forces, with major battles fought throughout the Nile Valley. The conflict reached its climax during the reign of Taharqa's successor, Tanatamani, who ruled from 664 to 656 BCE. Tanatamani launched what would be the last great Kushite invasion of Egypt, temporarily recapturing much of the country and even occupying Memphis. However, this success proved short-lived. The Assyrian king Ashurbanipal responded with a massive invasion force that not only drove the Kushites out of Egypt permanently but pursued them deep into Nubia, sacking Thebes and advancing as far south as the First Cataract. The Assyrian victory marked the end of Kushite rule over Egypt, but it did not mean the end of the kingdom of Kush itself. Retreating to their Nubian heartland, the Kushite kings established a new phase of their civilization that would last for another 1,000 years. This post-Egyptian period of Kushite history is often overlooked, yet it represents one of the most remarkable examples of cultural resilience and adaptation in the ancient world. Competing Egyptian dynasties, the Assyrian assault was a full-scale imperial conquest conducted by the most powerful military machine of the ancient world. Assyrian armies were equipped with iron weapons, siege engines, and cavalry, forces that gave them significant advantages over traditional Egyptian and Kushite forces. Despite these disadvantages, Taharqa mounted a vigorous defense of his empire. He reorganized his armies, incorporating new military technologies and tactics, and launched a series of counterattacks that initially drove the Assyrians out of Egypt. For several years, control of Egypt swung back and forth between Kushite and Assyrian forces, with major battles fought throughout the Nile Valley. The conflict reached its climax during the reign of Taharqa's successor, Tanatamani, who ruled from 664 to 656 BCE. Tanatamani launched what would be the last great Kushite invasion of Egypt, temporarily recapturing much of the country and even occupying Memphis. However, this success proved short-lived. The Assyrian king Ashurbanipal responded with a massive invasion force that not only drove the Kushites out of Egypt permanently but pursued them deep into Nubia, sacking Thebes and advancing as far south as the First Cataract. The Assyrian victory marked the end of Kushite rule over Egypt, but it did not mean the end of the kingdom of Kush itself. Retreating to their Nubian heartland, the Kushite kings established a new phase of their civilization that would last for another 1,000 years. This post-Egyptian period of Kushite history is often overlooked, yet it represents one of the most remarkable examples of cultural resilience and adaptation in the ancient world. After losing Egypt, the Kushite rulers faced the challenge of redefining their kingdom's identity and finding new sources of wealth and legitimacy. They responded to this challenge with remarkable creativity and success, transforming their kingdom into something even more distinctly African while maintaining the sophisticated administrative and cultural traditions they had developed during their imperial period. Meroë proved to be an inspired choice for a capital. The city was situated in a region with reliable rainfall, fertile agricultural land, and rich deposits of iron ore. Unlike the rest of the Nile Valley, which depended entirely on the river's annual flood for agriculture, the Meroë region could support crops year-round through a combination of Nile irrigation and seasonal rainfall. This agricultural abundance provided the foundation for a large, stable population and freed the kingdom from dependence on Egyptian grain supplies. Even more important was the iron ore. During the period of Kushite rule over Egypt, iron technology had been spreading throughout the ancient world, revolutionizing both warfare and agriculture. The Kushites had been quick to adopt ironworking techniques, and the rich ore deposits around Meroë made their kingdom one of the major iron-producing centers of the ancient world. Archaeological excavations at Meroë have revealed massive slag heaps, the remains of ancient iron smelting operations that earned the city the nickname, the Birmingham of ancient Africa. The shift to Meroë also marked the beginning of a gradual cultural transformation that would make the later Kushite kingdom increasingly distinct from its Egyptian-influenced predecessor. While the rulers continued to use Egyptian religious symbols and hieroglyphic writing for ceremonial purposes, they also began to incorporate more distinctly African elements into their culture. One of the most significant changes was linguistic. During the Napata period, the Kushite elite had used Egyptian as their primary written language, employing hieroglyphic and hieratic scripts for official documents and religious texts. But during the Meroitic period, they developed their own writing system, known today as Meroitic script, to record their native language. Meroitic script represents one of the earliest examples of an indigenous African writing system. It used a combination of hieroglyphic and cursive forms and was clearly derived from Egyptian writing systems, yet it was adapted to record a language that was fundamentally different from Egyptian. While scholars have succeeded in reading Meroitic texts phonetically, the language itself remains largely undeciphered, one of the great unsolved puzzles of ancient African history. The development of Meroitic writing was part of a broader cultural renaissance that saw the kingdom develop increasingly sophisticated and distinctly African forms of art, architecture, and religious practice. Meroitic artists created a distinctive style that combined Egyptian influences with African aesthetic traditions, producing sculptures, paintings, and decorative objects that are unlike anything else in the ancient world. Meroitic architecture evolved in equally distinctive directions. While early buildings in the kingdom closely followed Egyptian models, later structures incorporated new forms and decorative elements that reflected the kingdom's increasingly African character. The palaces and temples of Meroë featured courtyards, colonnades, and decorative schemes that were uniquely Meroitic, creating urban landscapes that were both familiar and foreign to visitors from the Mediterranean world. Perhaps the most striking examples of Meroitic architectural achievement were the royal pyramids built at Nuri, Kuru, and Meroë itself. The Kushite kings had begun building pyramid tombs during their rule over Egypt, reviving an ancient Egyptian tradition that had been abandoned for centuries. But the Kushite pyramids were distinctive in their proportions, construction techniques, and associated religious practices. Unlike their Egyptian counterparts, Kushite pyramids were typically built with steep angles and relatively narrow bases, giving them a distinctly different appearance. They were also constructed using different techniques, with the core structure built of local stone and the outer facing of sandstone blocks carefully fitted together. Many Kushite pyramids were decorated with elaborate relief carvings depicting religious scenes, royal ceremonies, and mythological subjects. The burial practices associated with these pyramids also evolved in distinctly Kushite directions. While early royal burials closely followed Egyptian practices, later Meroitic tombs incorporated elements that reflected the kingdom's increasingly African character. The royal graves contained distinctive pottery styles, locally manufactured jewelry and weapons, and evidence of religious practices that blended Egyptian and African traditions. The religious life of the Meroitic kingdom represents one of its most fascinating aspects. While the Kushites continued to worship Egyptian gods like Ammonius, Isis, and Osiris, they also incorporated local African deities into their pantheon and developed new religious practices that reflected their unique cultural synthesis. The most important of these local deities was Apidmak, a lion-headed god who had no Egyptian equivalent. Apidmak was associated with war, fertility, and royal power, and his worship became increasingly prominent during the Meroitic period. Temples dedicated to Apidmak were built throughout the kingdom, featuring distinctive architectural forms and decorative programs that had no precedent in Egyptian religious architecture. The kingdom's religious practices also incorporated elements from the broader African world. Archaeological evidence suggests that the Kushites maintained religious and cultural connections with peoples living far to the south and west of the Nile Valley, participating in religious traditions that spanned much of the African continent. This religious synthesis was reflected in the kingdom's political ideology. The Meroitic kings continued to use pharaonic titles and symbols, presenting themselves as legitimate heirs to the ancient Egyptian tradition. Yet they also incorporated distinctly African concepts of kingship, including the important role of royal women in political and religious life. The prominence of women in Meroitic society was one of its most distinctive characteristics. Throughout Kushite history, royal women had played important political roles, serving as regents, priestesses, and even independent rulers. But, during the Meroitic period, the political power of women reached unprecedented levels. A series of powerful queens, known by the title Candake, from which comes the English name Candace, ruled the kingdom either independently or as co-rulers with male kings. These queen mothers were formidable political figures who commanded armies, conducted diplomatic negotiations, and commissioned major building projects. The most famous of these was Queen Amanirenas, who ruled during the 1st century BCE and conducted a successful war against Roman forces that had invaded Kushite territory. The war between Queen Amanirenas and Rome provides a fascinating glimpse into the continued military prowess of the Kushite kingdom. When Roman forces, under the command of Petronius, invaded Kushite territory around 25 BCE, they initially achieved significant success, capturing several Kushite towns and advancing as far south as Napata. However, Queen Amanirenas organized a counterattack that not only drove the Romans out of Kushite territory but pursued them deep into Roman-controlled Egypt. The conflict ultimately ended in a negotiated settlement that was highly favorable to Kush. The Romans agreed to withdraw from disputed territories and waive tribute payments that they had earlier demanded from the Kushite kingdom. This diplomatic victory demonstrated that even centuries after losing control of Egypt, Kush remained a formidable military and political power. The economic foundations of the Meroitic kingdom were as impressive as its military and political achievements. While the loss of Egypt had certainly reduced the kingdom's wealth, the Kushites successfully developed new sources of prosperity that made Meroë one of the richest cities of the ancient world. Iron production was a major component of this economic renaissance. The smelters of Meroë produced not only the iron tools and weapons needed by the kingdom's own population but also surplus iron for export to other parts of Africa and the Mediterranean world. Kushite iron was highly prized for its quality and became a major trade commodity. The kingdom also maintained its traditional role as a conduit for trade between sub-Saharan Africa and the Mediterranean world. Caravans continued to pass through Kushite territory, carrying gold, ivory, exotic animals, and other luxury goods northward while bringing Mediterranean products southward. The Kushite kings taxed this trade and provided the security and infrastructure necessary to maintain the commercial routes. Agriculture remained another important source of wealth. The fertile lands around Meroë supported large populations and produced surplus crops for trade. The Kushites developed sophisticated irrigation systems that allowed them to cultivate crops throughout the year, taking advantage of both the Nile flood and local rainfall patterns. Perhaps most remarkably, the Kushites also developed what appears to have been the ancient world's first industrial economy. The concentration of iron smelting, pottery production, textile manufacturing, and other crafts at Meroë created an urban center unlike anything else in the ancient world. Archaeological evidence suggests that thousands of workers were employed in these industries, supported by complex supply chains that brought raw materials from across the kingdom and distributed finished products throughout Africa and beyond. This industrial development was supported by significant technological innovations. Kushite engineers developed new techniques for iron smelting that allowed them to produce higher quality iron more efficiently than their competitors. They also pioneered new methods of pottery production, creating distinctive ceramic styles that were widely imitated throughout the region. The textile industry was particularly sophisticated. Kushite weavers produced high-quality cotton and linen fabrics that were exported throughout the ancient world. Archaeological remains include evidence of complex looms, dyeing techniques, and finishing processes that produced textiles comparable to the finest products of the Mediterranean world. This economic prosperity supported a remarkable cultural flowering during the Meroitic period. The kingdom's artists, architects, and craftsmen created works of unprecedented sophistication and beauty, many of which survive today in museums and archaeological sites throughout Sudan. Meroitic sculpture represents perhaps the highest achievement of ancient African art, working in a variety of materials including sandstone, granite, bronze, and gold. Kushite artists created portrait sculptures, religious statues, and decorative objects that rank among the masterpieces of ancient art. These works show a distinctive blend of Egyptian, Mediterranean, and African influences, creating a unique artistic synthesis that was purely Kushite. The kingdom's architects created equally impressive works. The temple, complexes at Meroë, Musawer at Sufra, and other sites feature sophisticated planning, innovative construction techniques, and decorative programs of extraordinary richness. These buildings demonstrate a thorough understanding of classical architectural principles while incorporating distinctly African elements that create entirely new aesthetic experiences. Even everyday objects from the Meroitic period demonstrate the kingdom's high level of artistic achievement. Pottery vessels, jewelry, weapons, and household items all show careful attention to both functional and aesthetic considerations. The famous Meroitic pottery, with its distinctive decorative motifs and high-quality fabrication, was traded throughout the ancient world and has been found in archaeological sites from Egypt to Ethiopia. This cultural achievement was supported by a sophisticated educational system that produced literate administrators, skilled craftsmen, and learned priests. While we know relatively little about Meroitic educational practices due to the undeciphered nature of their written language, the evidence suggests that literacy was more widespread in Kush than in most ancient societies, including Egypt. The kingdom maintained diplomatic and commercial relationships with powers throughout the ancient world. Meroitic ambassadors traveled to Rome, Constantinople, and other major centers, while foreign merchants and diplomats visited the Kushite court. These international connections exposed the kingdom to new ideas and technologies while spreading Kushite influence throughout the known world. Yet despite these foreign contacts, the Meroitic kingdom maintained its distinctly African character. The society that developed during this period represented a unique synthesis of influences from across the ancient world, but it remained fundamentally rooted in African traditions and values. The role of women in Meroitic society, for example, reflected African traditions of female leadership that were quite different from Mediterranean practices. The prominence of royal women in politics, religion, and business was not simply an adoption of Egyptian practices but reflected deeper African traditions that gave women important roles in social and political life. Similarly, the kingdom's religious practices, while incorporating Egyptian and Mediterranean elements, remained fundamentally African in their emphasis on ancestor worship, nature spirits, and the sacred relationship between rulers and their subjects. The great temple complexes of the Meroitic period were not simply copies of Egyptian models but represented new syntheses that incorporated religious traditions from throughout the African continent. The economic system of the Meroitic kingdom also reflected distinctly African practices. The emphasis on iron production, for example, built upon African traditions of metalworking that were far older than Egyptian influence. The kingdom's agricultural practices incorporated techniques that had been developed by African peoples for millennia, while the trade networks that supported Meroitic prosperity connected the kingdom to commercial systems that extended deep into the African interior. During its height, roughly from 300 BCE to 300 CE, the Meroitic kingdom was probably the most prosperous and sophisticated state in Africa. Its capital city rivaled Alexandria, Carthage, and other great urban centers of the ancient world, while its cultural achievements influenced peoples from the Mediterranean to the heart of the continent. The kingdom's influence extended far beyond its political borders. Meroitic art, styles, architectural forms, and technological innovations were adopted by peoples throughout northeastern Africa and the Nile Valley. The kingdom's writing system influenced the development of other African scripts, while its religious practices spread throughout the region. Trade goods manufactured in Meroitic workshops have been found in archaeological sites throughout Africa, the Mediterranean world, and even as far away as India and China. These discoveries testify to the far-reaching commercial networks that connected the kingdom to the broader ancient world economy. Perhaps most importantly, the Meroitic kingdom served as a bridge between the classical Mediterranean world and the broader African continent. Through its diplomatic, commercial, and cultural connections, the kingdom facilitated the exchange of ideas, technologies, and practices between these two great cultural regions. Yet even as it maintained these international connections, the Meroitic kingdom remained fundamentally an African state. Its political institutions, social practices, and cultural values reflected African traditions that had developed over millennia. The synthesis that the Kushites created was not simply an adoption of foreign practices but a creative blending that produced something entirely new and distinctly African. The decline of the Meroitic kingdom, which began around 300 CE, was a gradual process that reflected changing economic and political conditions throughout the ancient world. The rise of Aksum, a powerful kingdom in what is now Ethiopia, challenged Kushite control over Red Sea trade routes. The expansion of nomadic peoples from the western deserts disrupted traditional trade routes and put pressure on the kingdom's resources. Perhaps most significantly, the Christianization of the Roman Empire reduced demand for traditional African luxury goods while creating new commercial networks that bypassed Kushite territory. The kingdom's economy, which had depended heavily on long-distance trade, began to contract as these traditional commercial relationships disappeared. The political fragmentation of the later Roman Empire also affected Kushite prosperity. The kingdom had maintained profitable relationships with Roman merchants and officials, but as Roman authority weakened and the empire split into eastern and western halves, these relationships became less reliable and lucrative. Internal factors also contributed to the kingdom's decline. Archaeological evidence suggests that the later Meroitic period was marked by increasing political instability, with frequent changes of rulers and evidence of internal conflicts. The sophisticated administrative systems that had supported the kingdom's earlier prosperity appear to have broken down, leading to reduced economic efficiency and political coordination. Environmental factors may also have played a role. Some scholars suggest that climatic changes during this period reduced rainfall in the Meroitic region, making agriculture less productive and reducing the kingdom's ability to support large urban populations. Yet even as the centralized Kushite state declined, the cultural achievements of the Meroitic period continued to influence the development of northeastern Africa. The kingdom's successor states inherited many Kushite political, religious, and cultural traditions, while Meroitic artistic and architectural styles continued to influence regional development for centuries after the kingdom's political collapse. The conversion of the region to Christianity during the 6th century CE marked the final end of the classical Kushite tradition, yet even the Christian kingdoms that emerged in the former Kushite territory retained important elements of their predecessors' cultural heritage. The distinctive architectural styles, artistic traditions, and political practices of medieval Nubian Christianity all show clear influences from the earlier Kushite period. The legacy of the Kingdom of Kush extends far beyond its immediate historical context. As one of the most sophisticated civilizations of the ancient world, Kush demonstrated the capacity of African societies to create complex political institutions, advanced technologies, and rich cultural traditions that rivaled anything produced in the Mediterranean world. The kingdom's achievements in metallurgy, architecture, and urban planning influenced technological development throughout Africa and beyond. Kushite innovations in iron production, for example, played a crucial role in the spread of iron technology throughout sub-Saharan Africa, contributing to agricultural and social developments that shaped the continent's history for millennia. The kingdom's political institutions provided models for statecraft that were adopted by successor states throughout the region. The sophisticated administrative systems developed by the Kushites, their diplomatic practices, and their methods of managing diverse populations all influenced the development of later African kingdoms. Perhaps most importantly, the Kingdom of Kush stands as a powerful example of African agency in the ancient world. Far from being passive recipients of foreign influence, the Kushites actively shaped their own destiny, creating a unique civilization that successfully synthesized influences from across the ancient world, while maintaining its distinctly African character. The military achievements of the Kushite kings, from their conquest of Egypt to their successful resistance against Roman expansion, demonstrate that African states were fully capable of competing with the great powers of the ancient world. The cultural achievements of the Meroitic period show that African societies could create sophisticated artistic and intellectual traditions that ranked among the highest achievements of human civilization. In many ways, the Kingdom of Kush quietly outshined ancient Egypt by demonstrating qualities that the northern kingdom often lacked. While Egypt was frequently divided by internal conflicts, invaded by foreign powers, and dominated by foreign dynasties, Kush maintained its independence and cultural integrity for over 1,000 years. The Kushite rulers showed a remarkable ability to adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining their core identity. When they lost control of Egypt, they did not collapse into insignificance but reinvented their kingdom as a distinctly African state that continued to prosper for centuries. This adaptability and resilience reflects a sophistication in statecraft that few ancient civilizations could match. The kingdom's commitment to cultural synthesis also distinguished it from many of its contemporaries. Rather than simply adopting foreign practices or rigidly rejecting outside influence, the Kushites created a unique blend of traditions that drew from across the ancient world while remaining fundamentally African. This cultural creativity produced achievements in art, architecture, and technology that were genuinely innovative and influential. The role of women in Kushite society was far more progressive than in most ancient civilizations, including Egypt. The prominence of queens like Amon-Irena's in political and military affairs demonstrates a level of gender equality that was rare in the ancient world and reflects African traditions of female leadership that were more advanced than Mediterranean practices. The kingdom's economic achievements were equally impressive. The development of what appears to have been the world's first industrial economy at Meroë represents a level of economic sophistication that Egypt never achieved. The kingdom's success in maintaining prosperous trade relationships with powers throughout the ancient world while developing substantial domestic industries shows a level of economic understanding that was centuries ahead of its time. Perhaps most remarkably, the Kingdom of Kush achieved all of this while maintaining its African identity and values. Unlike many ancient civilizations that either dominated their neighbors or were dominated by foreign powers, Kush successfully maintained its independence and cultural integrity while actively engaging with the broader world. The archaeological record of the kingdom continues to yield new discoveries that reveal the full extent of Kushite achievements. Recent excavations at Meroë and other sites have uncovered evidence of technological innovations, artistic achievements, and economic activities that demonstrate the kingdom's sophistication and influence. Modern scholars are increasingly recognizing that the Kingdom of Kush was not simply a peripheral civilization influenced by Egypt, but a major power in its own right that made crucial contributions to the development of human civilization. The kingdom's achievements in metallurgy, architecture, writing, and statecraft influenced the development of Africa and the broader ancient world in ways that are only now being fully understood. The story of Kush also challenges many traditional assumptions about the relationship between Africa and the Mediterranean world. Rather than being a passive recipient of foreign influence, Africa was an active participant in ancient international relations, contributing ideas, technologies, and practices that influenced civilizations from Europe to Asia. The Kushite experience demonstrates that African societies were fully capable of creating sophisticated civilizations that could compete with any in the ancient world. The kingdom's achievements in art, architecture, technology, and statecraft rank among the highest achievements of human civilization and deserve recognition alongside the more familiar accomplishments of Greece, Rome, and Egypt. As we conclude our journey through the remarkable history of the Kingdom of Kush, we are left with a profound appreciation for the achievements of this extraordinary African civilization. From their early emergence as skilled warriors and traders along the Nile, through their conquest and rule of Egypt, to their final flowering as an independent African kingdom at Meroë, the Kushites consistently demonstrated qualities of leadership, creativity, and resilience that mark the highest achievements of human civilization. The kingdom's legacy extends far beyond its immediate historical context. The political institutions, artistic traditions, and technological innovations developed by the Kushites influenced the development of Africa for centuries after their decline. Their example of successful cultural synthesis continues to offer lessons for modern societies struggling to balance tradition and change, local identity and global engagement. Perhaps most importantly, the Kingdom of Kush stands as a powerful reminder of Africa's central role in human history. Far from being isolated from the mainstream of world civilization, Africa was actively engaged in shaping the development of human society from the earliest periods of recorded history. The achievements of the Kushites demonstrate that African societies were not only participants in this process but often leaders in developing new forms of political organization, artistic expression, and technological innovation. In our modern world, as we seek to understand the complex relationships between different cultures and civilizations, the example of Kush offers valuable insights. The kingdom's success in maintaining its identity while engaging with foreign influences, its commitment to cultural synthesis rather than domination, and its progressive approach to questions of gender and social organization all provide lessons that remain relevant today. The story of how the kingdom of Kush quietly outshined ancient Egypt is ultimately a story about the capacity of human societies to transcend the limitations of their circumstances and create something truly remarkable. Through their achievements in war and peace, in art and industry, in politics and religion, the Kushites demonstrated that greatness is not the monopoly of any single culture or civilization but represents the highest expression of human potential that can emerge anywhere under the right conditions. As the gentle currents of the Nile continue to flow northward through the granite cataracts of Sudan, carrying with them the whispers of ancient glories, we are reminded that the most profound achievements of human civilization are often those that develop quietly, away from the spotlight of contemporary attention, building strength and beauty through patient dedication to excellence and the preservation of what is most valuable in human experience. The kingdom of Kush achieved something that few civilizations have accomplished. It created a society that was both deeply rooted in its own traditions and genuinely open to the best that other cultures had to offer. In doing so, it became not just a great African kingdom, but a testament to the potential for human societies to achieve greatness through wisdom, creativity, and the courage to chart their own course through the complexities of history. And so our journey through the remarkable story of Kush comes to an end, leaving us with a deeper appreciation for the richness and complexity of African history, and a renewed understanding of the many ways in which this great continent has contributed to the development of human civilization. In the quiet persistence of the Kushite achievement, we find not just an interesting historical curiosity, but a profound example of what human societies can accomplish when they combine respect for tradition with openness to innovation, local pride with global engagement, and the wisdom to know that true greatness lies not in dominating others but in realizing the highest potential within themselves.